We'll be reading from Matthew chapter 17, verses 1 through 5. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, his brother, and led them up on a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his garments became as white as light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 tabernacles here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And behold, a voice out of the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him."
Matthew chapter 17, as was read just a moment ago, we have a very fascinating event in Jesus' ministry. We have the Transfiguration. And I think it's kind of one of those times, one of those stories that we all kind of know about, but it's kind of mysterious in some ways, isn't it, as to all that was going on and exactly what was being shown to us. But the Bible tells us that Jesus went up a high mountain, and he brought with him Peter, Andrew, and James. Peter, James, and John. I'll get that right in a second. Peter, James, and John. And these disciples, we know that they are ones that are very close to Jesus. They're very much in that what we might call that inner circle of disciples, that sometimes when Jesus does take certain ones away with him to something unique, such as Gethsemane, these are the guys that tend to be taken. And that may be the reason why Jesus took them on this particular day up onto this mountain. It may be a combination of the two, that he wanted 3 witnesses. Because what is going to take place on this mountain is going to be something that Jesus wants witnessed about later. And so to meet that criteria of witnesses, you needed 2 or 3. And so he brings 3 instead of just 2, so that he makes certain that he has the valid witness proof. Some think that this took place on Mount Tabor, which is in the Jezreel Valley. I tend to think that it's probably Mount Horeb, which is in northern Israel. It's the highest mountain in all of Israel. It is in a location that's very close to where the story that we looked at this morning, and that it was very close to Caesarea Philippi. And Jesus seems to have been going in that direction at that time, this just being a short time afterwards. It says that Jesus went up onto the mountain to pray. As we look at the 3 different accounts that talk about the Transfiguration, it says that he went up on the mountain to pray, and while he was praying, he was transformed. He was transfigured. He became glorified. Luke chapter 9 and verse 32, in the account there concerning this event, it says that the disciples were asleep. Those guys could sleep anywhere, couldn't they? I told Jeannie, I said, I'm not sure that those inner closest guys might not have narcolepsy or something, because they seem to always be falling asleep. But Jesus is obviously praying, and while he's praying, these guys apparently have fallen asleep in Jesus' prayer, in the time that he's praying there. Very similar to the Garden of Gethsemane, maybe impression of that. But here they are, they're asleep, and they awake to the events that are taking place, to the things that are going on there around him. They awoke to see Jesus transfigured, to see Jesus in all of his glory. And I guarantee you, if they were asleep, they were very wide awake at that particular point with the things that they looked up and they saw. The text tells us that Jesus' face shined like the sun. Similar description is symbolically is shown to us in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 16, as John writes there, that same type of description of Jesus. His garments became like bright white light. And so Jesus is definitely looking different than he was when he walked up that mountain. Anytime you're in the presence of God, this idea of this shining seems to come out. We look back to Exodus and we see Moses, and he's been in the presence of God. And being in the presence of God, he comes out and his face is shining. And so much so that they put a veil over it because it's a little disconcerting to see his face shining like that. But just being in the presence of God, being in God's glory, caused this to seem to take place with Moses in Exodus 34. You know, the divine nature of Jesus in this particular case overrode his flesh and showed his power and his glory and his majesty as God. John would later write, John being one of the men that are there, that's there on this particular time, he wrote in John chapter 1 and verse 14, he says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw His glory, glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth." You know, John may have been including this event. I mean, certainly, as John thinks back and he looks over the entirety of the time that he spent with Jesus in his ministry, the glory of Jesus, the glory of God in Jesus was shown many times in various ways, but certainly there's probably no time in which it showed to John like it showed right there, as he literally saw this radiant Jesus Christ here on the top of this mountain. Well, as I told you, it's been a few days. In fact, it's been 6 days exactly since Peter's confession that we talked about this morning. And you know, Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus is showing that now. Jesus is manifesting this in a very powerful way, the exact confession that Peter made. And Matthew is, in his writing, when you look at Matthew's writings, you need to understand he doesn't always write sequentially. And so Matthew kind of groups things together. And so I think it makes sense. Now, it seems even in the ones that do write sequentially that these two things, these two events, the confession by Peter and the Transfiguration, that they do come in close proximity to one another. In fact, 6 days of one another. So, but we do see that, you know, it's interesting that these things happened together. But Jesus, when they look up and they see Him in all of His radiance, He's standing there and He's talking to Elijah and Moses. I find that amazing. I wonder to some degree, how does Peter and James and John know that that's Elijah and Moses? They know somehow, and certainly they could have had that given to them miraculously. Knowledge given by God is not something that's unusual in this particular day and time that they are seeing this. But when we think about what was being said by Jesus in this conversation, the conversation that He was having with these two greats of the Old Testament, Luke tells us in Luke chapter 9 and verse 31 that Jesus and Moses and Elijah were talking about His departure, about the things that Jesus was about to do in Jerusalem. Jesus is standing there talking to Elijah. He's standing there talking to Moses about His impending death. Probably the only two individuals that Jesus talked to about His death that we have recorded at any rate that probably believed what He was saying, right? Because we know that Peter didn't. We know that the apostles constantly fought Him on it. And so He has this conversation, this unrecorded conversation about His departure or His death in the city of Jerusalem that is upcoming. Moses represents for us the law. Elijah, in this particular case, he represents the prophets. And so we have the law and the prophets, as it's often termed in the New Testament, shown to us here in Elijah and Moses being present. Peter sees this, and Peter's never seems to be at a loss for words. And he looks at this, and actually we're told in one of the other gospel accounts that the conversation that Jesus was having with Elijah and Moses had concluded, and they were actually leaving. And Peter says to Jesus, "It's good that we're here. And if you give me permission, or if you want me to, I will build 3 tabernacles, or I'll build 3 meeting tents. I'll build 3 tabernacles, one for Elijah, one for Moses, and one for you, Lord." Sounds like a good idea. These are, Elijah and Moses. Who could look down on that, right? I mean, those are great guys, and here they are standing there with Jesus on this mountaintop. And so, it makes sense, and certainly they're held in high esteem by by Jews. And so what Peter says is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is something that doesn't understand the reality of what's going on. It's something that comes from a shallowness in understanding what God's plan is, because he looks at these three. He looks at Elijah, and he looks at Moses, and he looks at Jesus, and he looks at them on an equal basis. But folks, they're not equal. They're nowhere close to being equal. And the Father in heaven sees fit at this moment to make certain that Peter knows that while he looks at these three as equal, they're not equal. Cloud comes down upon them, and in verse 5, Jesus says, while he was still speaking, that being Peter still speaking, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and behold, a voice out of the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." There's a little bit of a Peter be quiet in that statement, isn't there? But there's something more than even that. Peter needs to be quiet and listen. He needs to speak less and hear more as to what Jesus is saying in this particular case. In Luke, it's interesting because Luke tells us that God says, the Father says, "This is my chosen one." Now, that's a whole other thing, isn't it? Because you're looking at Elijah, you're looking at Moses, and you're looking at Jesus, and God says, "That's my chosen one." Not Moses, not Elijah, Jesus. Listen to him. Well, Luke gives us an insight there that I think helps us understand a little bit more as to what God is saying here. This cloud descending upon them does take us back, though, to the Old Testament, doesn't it? In Exodus chapter 40 and verse 34, the cloud descended upon the tabernacle, right? It showed God's presence. They had a meeting place where Moses would go to this tent and he would meet and speak with God. And when God was speaking to him, a cloud came down upon it. And he would speak to Moses there in that tent of meeting that was just outside of the camp. But we see this as the glory of the Lord. And as a result, it fills this place. It would fill the place of the tabernacle. And here, it seems to fill this place as well. And so it's interesting that he would take something that is from the time of Moses, one of the ones that is there, and use that as a way to manifest himself in this particular situation. Well, this cloud formed, and according to Luke, says that it came down, and as they were entering into the cloud, so literally the cloud comes down on to the disciples. That's when when the Father, speaks these words in regard to Jesus and tells them to listen to him. When we think about that, we see that Jesus was the one to be listened to. Hebrews chapter 1 and verses 1 through 2 reiterates that when he says, God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers and the prophets in many portions and in many ways, in these last days has spoken to us in his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the world. So Jesus is the one to listen to. He is the one that he has superseded Elijah. He has superseded Moses. And certainly we understand that he is going to fulfill the law of Moses, nail it to the cross, and it's going to come to an end, and the Christian dispensation is going to begin, a dispensation that is based on the words of Jesus Christ. Well, rightfully so. I don't think any of us are surprised. And I think if a cloud descended on this building today and God spoke, we'd be just like the disciples. They're terrified, right? They're terrified. I don't think you can ever come into the presence of God, however he might manifest himself, and not be scared. He is powerful. It's not that you're scared because he's mean or bad. You're scared because he's powerful. He's so much greater than we are. It's unfathomable. And so they are terrified, and they fall down on their faces. And it has a powerful effect upon them. And while they fall down on their faces, this scene seems to disappear. Everything that's going on seems to go away. And it's just Jesus and the disciples. And Jesus walks over to them and he touches them. It's one of those situations where we see Jesus touching them and reviving them, kind of bringing them back to the moment. And he tells them to get up and to not be afraid. When they look up, they are alone. It is just Jesus standing there. Elijah and Moses are gone. The cloud's gone. And they are once again with the Lord. You know, as they descended the mountain, Jesus tells the three disciples to tell no one. Tell no one what they saw on the mountain. And I can only conclude that may even mean the other disciples. Because he says to tell no one until the time in which the Son of Man was risen from the dead. And so until Jesus' resurrection came, remember they're talking about His death on the mountain, and now He says, I don't want you to say anything to anyone about this until after the Son of Man has risen from the dead. Well, they are to be the witnesses to this event. And that's very important. And John spends a lot of time in his books talking about being a witness to Jesus Christ, because he was dealing with people that said Jesus didn't really exist. And so he's like, I'm a witness to this. Apostles are witnesses to these things that I'm telling you about. And so that's a very important aspect to the teaching in the New Testament. Luke chapter 9 and verse 36 tells us that these three men did not tell anyone as to what took place there on that mountain on that particular day. You know, they did not understand the last part of that statement. They heard Jesus say, don't tell anybody about this, and they've heard Jesus say that to them before. But in Mark chapter 9 and verse 10, it says that they seized upon that statement, discussing with one another what rising from the dead meant. So they just cannot accept in their minds and in their hearts Jesus dying. Even though He's talking about rising from the dead again, right? They will not accept His death, so you can't accept a resurrection if you won't accept a death. And so here they've just seen all of this, and they've seen Jesus glorified. And Jesus says, don't say anything till after the resurrection. And they hear that word resurrection, they go, who's rising from the dead? And yet Jesus has already been telling them time and time again that He is going to die. They just simply will not accept it. I want us to think about three truths. Three truths that are demonstrated in the Transfiguration that I think are important. First is the preeminence of Jesus religiously. You know, I know there's people in our world today who say there just can't be one way, but folks, there's just one way. He's preeminent to all things and all religions, whatever they may be, whatever you might believe. He is preeminent to them. And He's greater than the law of Moses. He's greater than the prophets. He is number one. He is first and foremost of all things. When we look at Colossians chapter 1 and verses 15 through 18, Paul writes, He is the image. And Hebrews says a similar thing. He says He's the express image in Hebrews chapter 1. But He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by Him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through Him, get this, and for Him. And He is before all things. And in Him all things hold together. He is to be first in all things. Continuing on, he says, and He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything He might be preeminent, or first. For in Him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. Jesus is first. And it's demonstrated there on that mountain. It's stated by the Father in heaven as He comes down in that cloud and speaks to them. The second truth I want us to take from this is that the dead are seen to continue to exist. I think that's very important. I think a lot of people really do just kind of despair because they think the dead are just kind of either they just go away and never, to nowhere, or, in some particular way that they're not existing somewhere else, and yet we see that they do. We could talk about the rich man and Lazarus that Jesus tells us about. But here we see two men that are especially Moses. Moses, we know, died and he was buried. And yet here he is, standing on this mountain on this particular day with Jesus. Elijah, while being taken up in a whirlwind, he's here on this day as well. And so, I think we see a truth that the dead they continue to exist. We see Abraham in the story of the rich man and Lazarus. And we know Abraham, he died and was buried in that cave at Machpelah. And so we know that that took place and is still there to this very day. And yet, there in that story, Jesus tells us that Abraham's talking, right? And I have no reason to believe that Abraham's not talking there. It's not a parable. So Jesus is actually giving us a glimpse at what took place there after death. And Abraham's speaking to the rich man. He's saying things to him in regard to his situation, in regard to what can and cannot be done, in regard to his brothers and even his own helping him, by putting a little bit of water on a finger and touching his tongue. These are people that are cognitive. They have memory, and they are very conscious and alive even after death from this physical world, or separation. Death simply means separation from this physical world. So I think we can take that truth from these events on that mount that day. Third, we see that Jesus is clearly shown to be more than human. Long time ago, I had a teacher in a class when I was young, probably a teenager, make the statement that Jesus was the only 200% human being, and that's absolutely right. He was 100% human. He's as human in flesh as you and me are, but yet at the same time, He never ceased to be God. So He's 100% God too. There was never a time when that percentage decreased. He chose not to use certain aspects of His divine nature, but He never ceased to be God. And any time He could take those back up, and He could be whatever He wanted to be because He's God. And so, I think we look at this and we see that Jesus is clearly more than a man. It's demonstrated in that transfiguration that took place on Him. He's more than what some people say, that He's just a good man. Folks, yes, He was a good man. He was the best man that ever lived on this earth. But He's more than that. He's God. And we can never forget that. A man can never accomplish what Jesus Christ can accomplish because He's God. And at the end of it all, that is where the power comes as a result of the sacrifice that He made upon this earth. He is God. He is divine. He has all power and authority given to Him. As we see in Matthew chapter 28 before He gives the Great Commission. He is eternal. Jesus has no beginning. He has no end. Yes, He was born on this earth, but even John the Baptist, who was older than Him, right, said He existed before me. Well, John's not talking about the physical life of Jesus. He's talking about the divine nature of Jesus. In the beginning was the Word, that is, that He pre-existed the beginning. And so Jesus is eternal. While you and I are given eternal life, we are not eternal in the sense that we have no beginning and we have no end. Folks, we have a beginning. Now, there is no end. That will go on and on, whether it's in punishment or whether it is in reward. It remains to be seen based on our actions. And Jesus is also, and tying into that eternal nature, Jesus is the I am. That statement of eternal present. There is no past, there is no future. Jesus just is eternally present. Time is created in the beginning. That's the beginning of time. God doesn't exist in that. He exists in eternity. He is eternally present. He looks at all of time like I look at the wall at the back of the building here. He sees it all, knows it all. And there is no moving forward or backwards in it for Him. He just is. That's why Jesus would say in John chapter 8, before Abraham was born, I am. Not I was, but I am. Using that eternal presence. So we see that Jesus is clearly more than just human. Jesus was changed that day while He was praying. He transfigured. And what the disciples saw was eventually spoken of after Jesus rose from the dead in order to change men. I mean, think about it. This makes perfect sense. Jesus said, I want you to wait and I want you to tell people about this after the resurrection. And you think about what people are going to say. Well, yeah, I saw that Jesus. And yeah, He did miracles, but other people did miracles too, right? I saw that Jesus and He did miracles, but He was just a man. And then you got Peter, James, and John saying, but we saw Him be more. Right? And there's three of us. We were all three there. We witnessed Him talk to Elijah. We witnessed Him talk to Moses. We heard the Father proclaim Him as the one to listen to, as the chosen one. We saw Him shine with radiance of the glory of God. There's a witness there that says He's more than a man. And so that's a powerful thing that they were going to be able to do at that time in which they began to preach. Jesus died and He rose so that you and I could be partakers of that divine nature manifested on that day, on that mountaintop in Jesus Christ. Peter says, 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 4, "For by these He has granted to us His precious and magnificent promises, so that by them you may become partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world by lust." See, we have a chance to be a part of that, to receive blessings from it, to receive power from it as God gives to His children. Jesus is first among all things. He died so that when we continue to exist after this death, just as Elijah continued to exist, just as Moses continued to exist, that when we continue to exist after we leave this physical life, we can do so in heaven. We can do so in paradise, as Jesus told the thief on the cross. He died to make those things possible for us because He is divine. Because He is God. And if He has said these things, then you can know that they will be true. Tonight, I hope that each of us follow the admonition of the Father in that cloud that day on that mountain. Listen to Him. Come and do as He said. Come to Him. And know the change that happens when a person listens to the words of Jesus Christ. It changes your life. It makes a difference. Not just spiritually. It certainly does that. We have no doubt about that. It can wash away our sins. It can make us new. It can make us right before God, be justified before God in judgment one day. But folks, it just makes for a better life in total. Jesus said, "I came to give you life and that you might have it more abundantly." He's talking about right here, right now. Yes, from an eternal standpoint, yes, it's better. It's always going to be better. It's far better than you can even imagine. But you can also have a better life here by coming to Christ. Because He knows a little something about people. Because He created us. And He knows what's best for us. And that's why He has given us the things that He's given us, so that we might have the best life. Any father, such as the Father in heaven that spoke that day, wants the best for his children. And yet there's always those children, right, that just resist. Even the most loving and caring parent. Don't be that child. Come to the Father. Find salvation through Jesus Christ, His Son, His chosen one. If we can help you with that this evening, we want to do so as we stand and as we sing. Rise up and build in the name of